On July 3, 1969, the ground in Kazakhstan opened up like a bomb had gone off, because one had. A rocket the size of a 30-story building tore itself apart on the launch pad, and the fireball was so massive it shattered windows over 25 miles away. It remains, to this day, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. Here's the part that should bother you. Almost nobody outside the Soviet Union knew it even happened, not for years, not for decades, because the country that caused it would never officially admitted it was racing anyone to the moon in the first place. They just quietly buried the wreckage, buried the story, and let America throw the biggest party in television history 17 days later. That explosion is the ending nobody talked about. To understand how we got there, we have to go back to the last place you'd expect a space program to start, a bombed-out Nazi weapons factory. The space race often gets remembered as humanity's greatest team-up, but it was actually the opposite. It was two superpowers pointing captured German weapons technology at the sky instead of at each other, betting national pride, billions of dollars, and human lives on who could prove their political system was superior. Stick with me, though, because the man who built the rocket that put Americans on the moon spent the first half of his career building weapons for Adolf Hitler. In 1945, as Germany collapsed, both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to grab the same prize, the scientists behind the V-2, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Think of the V-2 as the iPhone of weapons in 1944. Everything that came after was just an iteration on what it proved was possible. The chief designer was a young, ambitious engineer named Wernher von Braun. He wasn't just a scientist with bad luck. He was a member of the Nazi Party and an SS officer, and the V-2s he built were assembled by concentration camp prisoners at an underground factory called Mittelwerk, where more people died building the rockets than died from rockets hitting London. Here's the counterintuitive twist. Von Braun surrendered to American forces on purpose, specifically because he wanted to keep working on rockets instead of facing war crime charges. The U.S. agreed. Under a program called Operation Paperclip, America quietly scrubbed the Nazi history off the paperwork of von Braun and over 1,600 other German scientists and brought them home to build American missiles. Imagine hiring the architect of a bombing campaign to design your skyscraper 5 years later and telling nobody. The Soviets did the same thing, just less politely. They rounded up the German engineers who hadn't made it to the Americans and forced them to work in the USSR before eventually sending them home once Soviet engineers had absorbed everything they knew. So by the early 1950s, both superpowers were building rockets from the same original blueprint, refined by the same German brains, aimed at the same goal. Whoever controlled space could control everything underneath it, and in 1957, one side pulled the trigger first. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a polished metal sphere about the size of a beach ball with 4 spindly antennas trailing behind it. It didn't do anything. It couldn't take pictures, collect data, or perform any real experiments. All it did was orbit the Earth every 96 minutes, broadcasting a simple, steady beep, beep, beep. That's it. That's the whole payload. And it terrified the United States more than almost anything since Pearl Harbor. Here's why that beep was so effective. An amateur radio operator on Earth could tune in and hear it for themselves. The Soviets weren't just claiming they'd beaten America to space, they were broadcasting proof for free into American living rooms. It's the 1957 equivalent of your rival dropping a product demo that goes viral while your own team is still in its planning meetings. Americans looked up at the night sky knowing that a Soviet satellite was silently passing overhead every hour and a half and panicked. Schools scrambled to teach more math and science. Congress created NASA within a year. And the fear wasn't really, the Soviets have a satellite. It was more, if they can put something in orbit, they can put a nuclear weapon anywhere on Earth in 30 minutes. The beeping ball wasn't the threat. What it implied was, America needed a win, fast. Instead, they got humiliated twice more before they got anything close to one. In April 1961, the Soviets did it again. Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old fighter pilot, became the first human being to leave the atmosphere, orbiting the Earth once in a flight lasting just 108 minutes. He returned a global celebrity, and the Soviet Union had now beaten America to space twice in a row. Weeks later, America's own attempt to send a man into space barely qualified. Astronaut Alan Shepard's flight didn't even reach orbit. It just arced up and came back down, like a very expensive game of catch with gravity. The Soviets weren't just ahead, they were lapping the field. This is the moment President John F. Kennedy made the boldest bet in the history of government spending. In May 1961, with a grand total of about 15 minutes of American human spaceflight experience under NASA's belt, Kennedy stood before Congress and announced America would land a man on the moon and bring him home safely before the decade was out. Here's the part that surprises people. Kennedy actually didn't care much about space exploration itself. Privately, he told NASA administrators he wasn't interested in science for its own sake. He needed a dramatic, unambiguous win over the Soviets. And the moon was simply the most spectacular goal nobody had achieved yet, which meant nobody had already lost it either. It's the equivalent of picking a fight you can't lose, only because nobody had fought it before. Congress, national pride, and roughly 4% of the entire federal budget got pointed at one single goal. And then, 6 years into that promise, with the finish line in sight, the program nearly died on the launch pad before it even left the ground. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee climbed into the Apollo 1 capsule for a routine ground test. The rocket wasn't even fueled. Nobody expected danger. Then a spark ignited in the cabin and a capsule filled with pure oxygen. Chosen because it was simpler and cheaper for the engineering, the fire spread almost instantly. The astronauts died in under 30 seconds, unable to open the hatch designed to open inward, sealed by internal pressure. It gets worse before it gets better. The investigation found the accident wasn't some freak fluke. It was the predictable result of cut corners, flammable materials inside a pure oxygen environment, a hatch that took 90 seconds to open under ideal conditions, wiring insulation that had been nicked and exposed. NASA had built a program obsessed with beating a deadline and had quietly let safety slide to hit it. Here's the twist that actually saved the moon landing. Instead of scrapping the program, NASA used the disaster as a forced reset. They redesigned the hatch to open outward in 3 seconds. They switched to a safer oxygen-nitrogen mix on the ground. They replaced flammable materials throughout the capsule. The tragedy didn't kill Apollo. It's arguably the reason Apollo eventually worked. Sometimes the version of a plan that succeeds is the one that survived getting torn apart first. With a safer spacecraft and less than 3 years left on Kennedy's deadline, America had one shot left. And on the other side of the planet, the Soviets were about to lose the race in the most catastrophic way possible. By 1969, both superpowers were racing toward the same finish line with two completely different machines. America had the Saturn V, a rocket that remains the most powerful human machine ever successfully flown, tested, and retested across multiple full uncrewed missions before ever carrying a human being. The Soviets had the N1, a rocket so complex it used 30 engines clustered together in its first stage alone, because Soviet engineers hadn't solved how to build one engine as powerful as the Saturn V's. More engines meant more things that could go wrong simultaneously, and testing them all working in perfect sync on the ground was nearly impossible. The N1 never flew successfully, not once. It failed on all 4 attempted launches, and that July 3, 1969 explosion, the one that shattered windows 25 miles away, that happened during an uncrewed test just 17 days before Apollo 11 launched. The Soviet moon program was quietly and catastrophically dead. They never announced it. They simply stopped talking about landing on the moon and started calling their program something else entirely. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in front of an estimated 600 million people watching on television. At the time, this is the largest television audience in human history. Kennedy's impossible bet, made with 15 minutes of spaceflight experience to its name, had paid off with 8 years to spare. Here's the thing we're sitting with. The space race was never really about space. It was about 2 systems of government trying to prove which one could organize a nation to do the impossible, using rocket technology built by scientists who 20 years earlier had been designing weapons for the Third Reich. The beeping ball that terrified a nation, the astronauts who never got to finish their mission, and the massive explosion one side never admitted to happening, all of it fed into a competition that in the end gave us GPS, weather satellites, and the technology in the phone in your pocket right now. And it isn't over. Right now, The US, China, and private companies like SpaceX are racing back to the moon and on towards Mars, chasing the same mix of national pride, scientific ambition, and fear of being left behind. So here's the question worth asking. When the next flag gets planted somewhere new, will we actually know the full story behind it? Or will we, just like in 1969, only ever hear the version that made it out of the wreckage? If you found this as wild as I did, hit like, subscribe for more of these deep dives into the history nobody fully tells you, and let me know in the comments, do you think we would have gotten to the moon without the Cold War pushing us there?